First, welcome to this, which is the latest in a series of general election themed events here at the LSE. The idea being we've had a series of them on subjects as diverse as the future of the British Constitution, foreign affairs and defence, London, and one last week on higher education and student funding. But tonight's event is about social policy and inequality, and there's a hashtag up there for those of you who want it. Now, the panel is slightly smaller than it was originally going to be. First, because Eileen Munro, unfortunately, is unwell, so she isn't going to be here. Julian Legrand, as far as I know, is on his way, and we live in great hope. But let's just wait and see. Let's just go on for now. As I say, I'm Tony Travers from the LSE here, from the Government Department, and my colleagues are John Hills from the Social Policy Department, Professor John Hills, Professor Tim Newburn, and Professor Julian Legrand, when he arrives, also from the Department of Social Policy. Now, just by way of introduction, I personally think it would be impossible to exaggerate. It's easy to get tangled up in hyperbole when there are general elections. But this general election, for me, is particularly interesting and important. First, because it's very hard to predict the result. We've had other events where all the great psephologists of our time, election experts, say it's the hardest election to predict ever. And that means that the political framework in which government operates after the election will be fluid. There are opportunities in that, but there are also challenges. But that's on the politics side. On the economy and social policy side, I think it's particularly interesting because of the 5 years of austerity or public spending constraint that we've seen since 2010, and with a promise that, frankly, if the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, these big groupings, are likely to be the basis of the election of the government, whichever of them it is, that some form of constraint on public spending would be very different, well, slightly different between these two parties if they were in government on their own, all the way through to 2020. And if you just look at the size of the state that's possible, if you try to have no deficit in Britain, it's a smaller state than we have been used to. And that means that there's a kind of threat to all the public services provided by that very real constraint to potential constraint to public spending, unless a government were elected that was willing quite radically to put up taxes. And there hasn't been much evidence of that, though I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about this later. But beyond that, that public spending and taxation question, there is the wider issue of the management of public services. British governments have typically got into power with a 5 years to save, then you just fill in the dotted line, whatever the public service is. And they feel, and now, when there's a chance that they won't be in power for much more than 5 years at a time because of the changing politics, that sort of very strong sense we need to rescue the NHS or rescue schools, it seems to me, is likely to be even more powerful than in the past. The present government has substantially reformed the National Health Service. It's introduced new kinds of schools and been quite radical in education. And as far as policing is concerned, introduced a radical reform to police accountability in the shape of police and crime commissioners, which, and I will hear more about this, I'm sure, have been, successful, but only up to a point, or not. Still, so there's all of that. And beyond that, and Eileen would have spoken about this, I know, had she been here, there is this future of social care, always in the news, either for children or for older people. And as a result of that, the question of how social care is paid for and which institutional arrangements handle it, again, very, very important looking forward. Julian Legrand has also been involved in this world latterly, overseeing some authorities where these things have not worked so well. Then, on the other side of all of this tonight, inequality. And inequality, it seems to me, has risen up the political agenda in Britain, right across the board, actually, in a way that hasn't been true for a number of years. I'm not sure politicians are as certain what they feel they can do about it as they know it's more salient than it used to be. But again, we'll hear more about this a little bit in a few minutes. So, potential for radical changes to public policy against this background of political uncertainty, a great general election. And what we're going to do this evening is to hear from each of our contributors for 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, about what they think are the key issues and, in a broad sense, what the political parties ought not exactly to be doing, but the way they might think the issues that they should address in their manifestos, and, I would say, crucially, in the days after the election, if they're trying to do a deal for a coalition or some kind of minority government. Enough from me. John, you are going first.
Okay.
You said you agreed kindly.
This is a particular time in the political calendar for civil servants. They have a moment of liberation. The current government isn't going to do anything very much other than the budget, and the coalition can't agree on anything other than what was in its original programme. So civil servants have the opportunity to write briefs for incoming governments of all kinds. They've got a much more difficult task this time. I was at Westminster Tube Station yesterday, and I happened to find, dropped on the floor, a document labelled Top Secret. Brief for incoming Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, if not Ian Duncan Smith. Now, I have naturally posted it back to DWP, but I did take some notes, which I thought I would share with you. So it starts off by saying, congratulations on your appointment, Secretary of State. You will have been very well briefed on our topics on the Social Security budget and inequality. You will, in particular, have read the excellent series of papers produced by the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion in its Social Policy and a Cold Climate series, and available on the CASE website to download, all with convenient 8-page summaries and 1-page bullet point summaries on the front of them. So you will probably be familiar with all of these issues. First of all, and the wording of this says, wording depends on which party. You may have used in the election campaign statements that inequality is currently at its lowest level for the last 25 years. But of course you will be aware that those figures only go up to 2012-13 and stop in March 2013. And you will recall that all of the major cuts in benefits, both specific and in increasing working age benefits below inflation, started in April 2013. You will, if an incoming re-elected member of the coalition, have the embarrassment that in June you will be publishing the figures for 2013-14, and you will have known that modelling work suggested that the effect of the policies taking place after April 2013 were regressive and will have had the effect of increasing poverty and inequality, particularly in the years through to 2014-15. Now, the reason for that, note of special importance to Liberal Democrat members of the former coalition, although it sounds as if increasing income tax allowances to £10,000 was a progressive move that helped the low paid, in fact, we paid for that by cutting welfare benefits and working age benefits in general. The increase in the income tax allowance was not worth very much to people in the bottom half of the income distribution, where the cuts were much greater, the effects on them of the cuts in benefits and tax credits were much greater. On the other hand, for people in the top half of the income distribution, the income tax allowance rise was more valuable than their losses from the welfare cuts that paid for it. The big question for you, Secretary of State, as number one, is are you going to do more of the same? And it will depend, of course, who is elected, whether they're elected on a manifesto of continuing to increase income tax allowances beyond £10,600, and whether they have a manifesto commitment that they will continue to freeze working age benefits in cash terms, regardless of what happens to the rate of inflation. This, Secretary of State, may sound very technical, but actually one of the biggest issues around, in terms of both our spending and and what happens to inequality is how we uprate benefits from year to year. Whether we continue to freeze them so that they fall behind, so that living standards fall, and whether they fall behind other people's incomes, or whether we keep them up with other people's incomes and we keep up their living standards. The headlines may have been about things like the bedroom tax, but the boring decisions about how we adjust benefits from year to year, you remember very few people noticed in George Osborne's final, that's in square brackets, autumn statement in November 2014, that he announced there would be a cash freeze in all working age benefits, or nearly all working age benefits, from April 2016 and again in April 2017. That's one of the biggest issues in terms of both budget and inequality, as to whether we carry on cutting the real value of working age benefits. Issue number 2 is that built into the spending plans of the government, which brackets, most parties, close brackets, have signed up to, are that there will be continued cuts in, quotes, welfare spending. As you will recall from the book Good Times, Bad Times, The Welfare Myth of Them and Us by LSE Professor John Hills, published last November, the word welfare is extremely misleading. Sometimes it means the welfare state, spending in 2014-15 of £489 billion. Sometimes it means disparagingly called handouts to people of working age who are currently out of work. So cash transfers, things like job seekers allowance and so on. Spending in 2014-15 in Great Britain, £38 billion. That is only £1 in every £12.50 that we spend on the welfare state. And within that, of course, you will know that the job seekers allowance and its associated housing benefit, what people often mean when they're talking about, quotes, welfare, is only 20 pence out of every £12.50 that we spend on the welfare state. We therefore have a problem that all of the things people have announced that will save money are only a very small part of the actual overall budget. Somehow your task is to change the public's understanding on that in a way it was not changed during the course of the election campaign. Associated with that is that penciled in with the plans are what has already been advertised, that there will be unspecified £12.5 billion cuts in, quotes, welfare. And indeed, if you take, according to the Resolution Foundation, the trajectory for cuts in non-cash payment public spending, to meet the previous government's plans for deficit reduction and reduction in public spending by 2020, you're really talking about £20 billion of, quotes, welfare cuts. Are you serious, Secretary of State, that you are going to make £20 billion worth of cuts out of £38 billion worth of spending? Are you going to cut the single rate of job seekers allowance to £35 a week from £70 a week? Issue 3, Secretary of State, is what are you going to do about universal credit? The major working age benefit reform of your predecessor administration, which is amalgamating 5 working age benefits into one. There are lots of good reasons for doing this. However, your predecessor, Mr. Duncan Smith, whoever is Secretary of State, I believe, it will be the predecessor, originally planned that there would be 2 million people receiving universal credit by now. There are currently about 25,000 people. You have to decide whether to roll that out as planned or whether to have a pause while we decide whether it's actually sensible to implement it as originally planned. Whether it makes sense for people who are used to budgeting fortnightly or weekly to be paid monthly, and then face the problem of money possibly running out at the end of the week. You face the problem of deciding whether couples who are used to getting money paid in separate amounts will now have to renegotiate their family finances with a single payment. You will have to decide whether housing benefit will be rolled up into this benefit and paid up front in a single payment, or whether you want to change that in some way. You might like to note that the Scottish government has negotiated a number of amendments to universal credit which may change some of these ways that it's paid, and you may want to think about whether you want to do some of that. Issue number 4, Secretary of State, is something that the Treasury dumped on your predecessor in the March 2013 budget, and which took effect a month ago, that is on April the 6th. Something called pension freedom, that people who had saved in a pension were no longer compelled to turn it into an income for the rest of their life, an annuity, some of them rather poor value, and they can now do whatever they like with it. You will have read in last week's Sunday Times financial supplement pages, the people whose money has been taken away by the snake oil mine investment PLC company based in, I've got to be careful with this. Last time I said Colombia, and there was somebody from Colombia in the audience, based in
overseas,
a faraway country of which we know nothing, whose directors have disappeared. So far, they have highlighted the cases of 10 individuals who have lost their life savings in the hope of 10% per annum returns. There are more of those to come, and you will face the problem of whether you can introduce some kind of pause to this while we review the advice people get and can get within the 45 minutes we've currently promised, and whether in fact it does make sense for people to, as your minister, the previous Minister for Pensions, Mr. Steve Webb, of course this may be Mr. Steve Webb as Secretary of State, but I'll have to write a different brief, said he was totally relaxed about people blowing the proceeds on a Lamborghini because of the new state second pension reforms, which mean that people retiring from April 2016 will be getting much better pensions, state pensions in some cases. So you may want to commission an immediate review of this pension freedom, with the embarrassment that all political parties, as was seen in the election campaign, find it extremely embarrassing to say they would like to take choice away from people. It is very paternalist to say that having bribed you through the tax system to accumulate money in a pension, we should then tell you that you should use it for a pension. You may like to note, though, that there is an excellent new book published by Princeton University Press by Professor Julian Legrand from the London School of Economics, which he is talking about at the London School of Economics in May sometime, a couple of weeks' time from the election, I think, about why paternalism can be a very good idea, Secretary of State. Issue 5 is connected with that. You will remember at the previous election that the outgoing Chief Secretary left a note to his successor saying there's no more money. The note your predecessor has left for you is, did you realise that the state single-tier pension reforms that are coming in April 2016 were allowed through by the Treasury because they changed a very obscure bit of the national insurance contribution system called contracting out? You may not have realised yet, but everybody who works in the public sector and all of the people in the private sector who have been in a good employer pension scheme will be paying higher national insurance contributions from April 2016. Now, as far as the individuals are concerned, we've got a very good line on that, which is that they will get slightly better state pensions in return for their increased national insurance contributions. For their employers, though, there will be a 3.5% increase in employer national insurance contributions that will hit their wage bills in April. That means that every hospital has the choice of finding some money from somewhere to pay that 3.5% and therefore sack 1 in 30 of its employees, or mount a successful campaign to get those savings that the Treasury has already pocketed. Not a lot of people realise that. It's an unexploded bomb your predecessors have left for you, and you now have 8 months to solve it. Issue number 6 is a more obvious one to sign off on, and that is the effects of the Smith Commission agreement on devolution, which gives Scotland, and you will remember the Stormont House agreement signed just before Christmas 2014, gives quite a lot of freedom to the Northern Ireland government, to the Stormont government, quite a lot of freedom in how they administer working age benefits. There may be some things, Minister, you can learn from them, and that may be an advantage to you. Some of the groundwork may already have been done, of some of the changes you would like to do may have already been invented by the Scots and the Northern Irish. However, just to sign off on that, there is a very big constraint on you in your role as not just the Secretary of State for Social Security in Great Britain, but also as a member of a cabinet which will be setting income tax rates in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Given that the Scottish Government now has control of all income tax rates, you will find it impossible to vote through within Parliament without filibusters or riots or resistance in the House of Lords any change to income tax rates which relies on the vote of any MP from Scotland. The effect of this may well be that there are very few progressive ways in which you can raise revenue. However, there is an expert on how you cope with devolved budgets in this kind of situation called Professor Tony Travers at the London School of Economics, and I suggest you invite him in.
John, thank you very much. Very good. Right. Right. Excellent start. Does that mean, before I move on to Tim, that the national insurance contribution, both by employees and employers, which I have to admit had passed me by, but in a sense that is really, in the short term, putting taxes up, because this is, I mean, in the end, presumably these pensions will be higher in the future. Is that the effect of this? Well,
they will be a bit higher in the future.
But it's a tax
but only increase. A bit higher. So the pension, so I will get, at the moment, I am only entitled to the basic pension. But I will have, this is me speaking personally, sure, until I'm 66, after 2016, so I'll have 4 years or something, where I will be paying higher national insurance contributions and I won't get the full £147 a week rather than £109 a week pension, but I will get a bit more towards it.
Okay.
So in return for my contributions, I will get a bit more. But the LSE will now have to pay a higher employer national insurance contribution.
But
what it would get out of it would be if it could then pay me a lower university superannuation pension. I'm not sure it's going to be able to negotiate that. And I think I've had a feeling that the LSE finance people are already worrying about it. I'm sure that some hospital trusts are already worrying about it, and some schools are worrying about it. And I think the question is whether there's a collective action on behalf of schools and hospitals and less fashionable public sector employers to say, can't we have our money back, please?
So actually, it's not a tax increase; it's a spending cut in the public sector, really, isn't it? It will have the
effect of a spending cut. So that there is already built in a saving of several billion pounds to the Treasury.
Yeah.
That it will be getting these extra national insurance contributions. That's in all the plans everybody's operating on. Okay. But that will have the effect for a public sector employer and some private sector employees of a national insurance contribution increase, which they would have to meet through cutting something.
Okay, very good. Right.
I've suggested Julian.
Excellent.
Policy.
No, very good. Julian, welcome.
Well, thank you, and I do apologise for being late. And the thing I was in overran, and I didn't realise how far it was overrunning. So my apologies to everybody for that.
Well.
Right. So, day one after the election, and you're the permanent secretary, and you're called in by the minister and asked, well, what should I do? Basically, what should happen? Response ought to go something like this. Well, Minister, the first scream you are going to hear, the first catastrophe you are going to be warned about is money. You are going to be told endlessly and without cease that the National Health Service is under immense strain, it's under crisis, the whole thing is due to collapse. There is no hope. The morale in the National Health Service has never been lower. You will hear that phrase time and time again. There are vague murmurings of working to rule and strike action. And you will inevitably face these calls, and unless you put in vast quantities of money to rescue the health service from its dire state. Minister, you must resist these. The National Health Service does not need more money. In fact, the usual suspects, the reasons as why we're usually told as to why the National Health Service needs more money, the ageing of the population is not ageing that fast. The medical advances, most medical advances are cost-saving rather than cost-increasing. The general perception that there is an unrestricted and infinite demand for health services is entirely misleading. Germany, at the moment, spends somewhat more than we do as a percentage of GNP, not much more as a percentage of GNP on health services, actually has got surpluses among most sickness institutions, and they don't know what to spend it on. Step one is for you to resist this pressure for increased money for the National Health Service. There is an area, though, which you will be partly responsible for, which is that of social care. And social care, now here there is much more of a problem, Minister. In social care at the moment, we have these two systems of care. We have the National Health Service, which is free at the point of use, relatively unlimited demand, and unrestricted demand in the sense that people can go without paying anything, and with a fairly sort of generous entitlement. In social care is provided by local government rather than by the national government. It is funded locally, although with central government grants. It is heavily means-tested, and entitlement is severely restricted. Over the past few years, we've seen actually decline in the numbers of elderly people who are being cared for by the local authority. Despite the fact that more money has gone in, a little more money has gone in, there has nonetheless been a fall in the numbers of elderly people receiving care. Now, this is scandalous on a number of levels. It is scandalous because the demand for social care, unlike, say, in healthcare, the demand for social care is actually increasing, and increasing quite sharply. The divide between health and social care as to what is those things that are provided for free and those things that are provided for under heavily means-tested is arbitrary. Alzheimer's disease, some of the dementia associated with Parkinson's disease and so on, these are not, the care for those are not provided free. They're as disabling, and in fact, in many ways, almost more distressing than many of the major diseases such as cancer and so on. Yet they are heavily means-tested, and the result, it causes enormous distress, and it causes misunderstanding and among the general public. It causes enormous distress among both the ill people themselves and the carers themselves. Excuse me. Sorry, I have the remnants of a cold too. It is very difficult to justify either on principled grounds or upon need grounds this division. And what you will have to consider is what we are going to do about social care in the future. Are we going to move towards a system more like the National Health Service, where you get the social care free at the point of use, largely free at the point of use? Or are we going to try and align entitlements the other way by increasing charges or whatever within the National Health Service? My own recommendation, Minister, is you try and move towards increasing the amount of social care that is free at the point of use. Yes, that's going to involve increased taxation, but there are ways of doing it, and as we will be discussing, and John has now been looking at, there are ways of doing it that do not necessarily break the bank on each and every occasion. So, social care you have to do something about. Going back to the NHS, then, what are the problems you are going to face with the NHS? Well, you are going to have, after the screams have subsided about the extra money, you are going to also hear some problems about poorly performing hospitals. Now, on the whole, the British NHS doesn't do badly on most international indicators, certainly in terms of things like equity, partly because it's free at the point of use, it usually scores rather well. In terms of the areas where it doesn't do so well, unfortunately the areas which you might think are perhaps the most important, which is in terms of health outcomes, cancer survival rates, for instance, are not remarkable by international comparisons. More generally, we do have, every so often, underperforming hospitals, underperforming medical facilities of various kinds. And, Minister, there will undoubtedly be scandals that you will hear about, such as the scandals that took place under the last government at Mid Staffordshire Hospital and various others. So you will have to think about how you reform poorly performing institutions. Now, what have we learnt about poorly performing public sector institutions? And I may say, Minister, this applies probably just as much to other areas like schools or children's services departments as much as it does to hospitals or other medical facilities. What we've learnt is that, on the whole, they do not reform on their own. If they're doing badly, they carry on doing badly. Most of the hospitals that are doing badly now are the hospitals that were doing badly 20 years ago. Same is true of children's services departments. In my previous capacity, Minister, I was an academic working at the London School of Economics, and I looked at Doncaster and Birmingham children's services, which were performing dreadfully then, and indeed had been performing dreadfully for 20 years or more. It was clear they'd had, over that time, both Doncaster and Birmingham had enormous changes of leadership. In Doncaster's case, they had something like 3 changes of leader in a year. They were just simply changing the leadership, which is very fashionable, incidentally, as a way of trying to reform public sector institutions, failed abysmally there. And it has to be said generally, there isn't a great deal of evidence across most sectors, and including the medical sector, that simply changing the leadership or other ways of trying to engender internal reform will work. You need to have some kind of external pressure. Now, there are various ways you can exert external pressure. The Blair government started off with targets. Targets on so-called performance management. The performance management rather rapidly became known as, instead of targets and performance management, going rather rapidly known as Targets and Terror. It worked. It was actually quite terrifying. I myself was advising the Prime Minister at the time, and he would have what he called a monthly stock takes. And stock takes were every month where one minister would take place in the cabinet room. The minister, the Prime Minister and his aides would sit on one side of the cabinet table, and the minister, coupled with his or her civil servants, would sit on the and their political aides would sit on the other side of the table. At the other end, one end of the table, the head of the Prime Minister's delivery unit, essentially the organisation had been set up by the Prime Minister to find out what the various departments were doing. The Prime Minister would, after he had finished, would metaphorically lean across the table and pick up the minister by the scruff of his or her neck and say, "What's going on?" The minister would sob and promise to do better in future. The civil servants would shiver and scurry out of the room as fast as they could, back to their department, whether it's Department of Education or Department of Health or whatever. And they would then ring up, sometimes on a weekly basis, and terrorise the hospital that was missing its targets, or the medical facility that one way or another was not achieving its end. And, of course, terror actually works. And on the whole, it did rather well. The NHS met all its targets under the Blair government, and a lot of institutions did actually change their ways and reform in various ways. I think most of us working there at the time, though, did feel that at the end of the day, this was probably not the way to go. The targets had too many toxic side effects to actually be a real long-term solution to the problem of poor performance. They tended to distort priorities. What was resourced was what was targeted. What was resourced. What was not targeted was ignored. Excuse me. They led to gaming. There were various tricks that the hospitals employed and so on to make sure that they met the targets. Classic one was there was a target that 98% of attendees at accident and emergency rooms ought to be seen, treated, and discharged within 4 hours. But the 4-hour clock only started ticking the moment the patient actually crossed the boundary of the hospital. So the ambulances bringing in such patients were told to wait outside the hospital. They were told to queue up in the line outside the hospital in order until the 4-hour clock would permit them to enter in. And indeed, there are some remarkable photos of long lines of ambulances waiting outside with ill people in them, waiting outside. But I think the chief problem, Minister, with the targets and terror regime was the demoralisation and demotivation of the staff. The professionals don't like being told what to do, and are not very good at knuckling under if and when they are. It did lead to significant demoralisation and demotivation of the staff. So that's one form of external pressure. On the whole, Minister, you'll probably have to keep some of them. We still got some of the targets, and you'll probably have to keep them. But they should not be your chief instrument for trying to improve poor performance. A second source of external pressure is regulation, the regulator. The last government, the coalition government, began to move very heavily towards regulation as a way of trying to improve poor performance. They, in it gave considerable powers to new regulators. It encouraged the implementation of once in education, Ofsted. And in the NHS, it set up, it endorsed a number of regulators. The chief problem there, Minister, was that there were just too many of them. It depends how you define them, but there's something like 23 regulators in the National Health Service, and all giving slightly contradictory messages. And again, regulation has often the same sort of problems, the same sort of pressures as the same sort of demoralisation effects, heavy regulation that excuse me, that Targets and Terror does. So, what should be your next? What's the other source of pressure? Well, it can come from competition. You can have pressure from competition. Now, this was a big issue in the election campaign, as you'll know, Minister, and it got absorbed into the privatisation debate, the debate about the use of private providers to compete with public providers to provide public services. In fact, it was all an entirely misleading debate. Something like 35% of the NHS is already privately provided. GPs are private providers. Nonetheless, there are some issues there. There are politically sensitive issues that you will have to deal with. However, on balance, Minister, probably competitive pressure, although it has its problems, is probably the least worst of the various forms of pressure that we've been discussing, or the least challenge that it is necessary to provide to poor institutions. So, my recommendation to you, Minister, is probably to empower your patients through increasing the choices that they offer, empower the staff, perhaps going down a route of staff ownership and mutual ownership. That's something we haven't got time to discuss. Disempower the regulator, and, Minister, disempower yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And finally, Tim Newburn.
Tony, thank you very much, and my thanks to Tony and to British Government and LC for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to have been invited, and it's an even more an honour to speak after my two very distinguished colleagues to my left here. If you're going to tweet about it, the hashtag is hashtag terror actually works. Not the one that's there behind you. I just resisted doing that on Twitter. Maybe later. So, I was wondering how to do this, and John and Julian have helpfully sorted it out. So, John stumbled across a document, top secret, which was the culmination of civil servants' work at the end of the period of PERDA, which they always love, because it's the one period in 4 or 5 years where nothing too disastrous, I hope, can happen, because governments aren't allowed to do anything, and no one can really talk about anything. And then Julian took us on to post-election, and the permanent secretary talking to the incoming Secretary of State about the options in front of her or him. I'm going to take us a little bit further back in that process and say, so this is the period this is the moment at the beginning of PERDA where there's the terrifying sight of blank screen or blank sheet of paper. What are the options for the incoming government? What might we offer them? And that's going to be a product of a couple of things, no doubt more than a couple of things, but two main things. What we imagine on the basis of what particular individuals or parties have said in the past, what might be acceptable to them and what might be on their agenda, and obviously what they've said during the election campaign. And then what we think is out there as a set of possibilities and options which we might be able, in some mild sense, to sell, with or without terror. So, in criminal justice, let me keep it very brief. There are two things to say before I kick off. The first is, this is maybe not going to be that crucial in this election. So the campaigning isn't necessarily going to give the civil servants a huge number of clues, I think. That's somewhat unusual. All elections since certainly since 1979, through to 2005, law and order, crime and justice, home affairs was quite big campaigning news. 2010, not so much. Things have moved on. People are much less worried about that. 2015, I suspect, will be rather like 2010. It's going to be dominated much more by the kinds of issues that John and Julian have been talking about, much less by law and order. Now, one of the reasons, and only one for that, is crime's going down. It's a much less salient issue for lots of people. For us as electors, I think, in all sorts of ways. And it's much less of, therefore, I think, an issue for politicians. It's also less of an issue because there's much less between them. We are in something of a post-ideological age, politically, I think, on the sort of law and order territory. The kind of blue water between the parties is a small rivulet somewhere. It's really not that great in the main, certainly between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. But where do the issues lie? And I'm going to talk briefly, very briefly, about three, and I will keep it brief. The first and the big one, I think, is policing. Tony alluded to it in his introduction. We have a reformist government, or more particularly, we have a reformist Home Secretary. You have the first reformist Home Secretary we've had, really, arguably, I think, though people always point to Roy Jenkins in the 60s, but those reforms were all private members' bills. This is the first reformist Home Secretary in the post-Second World War period, I think. The most radical reforming Home Secretary. He's done a huge number of things, controversial, some, not so controversial others, but things I think many of her Labour predecessors would not have, or they might have dreamt of doing them, but would not have had, for whatever set of reasons, they would not have put them into, and did not put them into action. They never got as far, really, as even ideas of any solidity. The main thing that she's done is reform the governance of the police. Introduced, as Tony said, police and crime commissioners, essentially single individuals in the 41 police force areas outside London who have basically complete control in negotiation with chief constables over the budgets and the general trajectory of their police forces. It was a controversial move, and it's not liked by many parties. And so the one clue that we have as civil servants in relation to the possibility of an incoming Labour government, or an incoming government of which the Labour Party is a significant part, is they've committed themselves to withdrawing, to removing police and crime commissioners, as really very much their first act in government. Now, what are we going to put down on our piece of paper? So if we're imagining a series of different political parties here, we don't have a difficulty if we have a Conservative government. We probably don't have a difficulty if we have a Conservative-dominated government. But if we have a government which has Labour Party membership significantly Labour-dominated, then we're going to have to deal with PCCs. And that's going to cost a lot of money. And it's going to be a radical overhaul, and it's not at all clear, even though they have done quite a lot of work on this, what the alternative is going to be. So we're going to have to do quite a lot of work here. But the big issue, I think, and the thing that, if I'm putting myself in the sort of Sir Humphrey's seat that Julian was doing earlier on, the advice here should be don't do it. Just do, this is an extraordinarily bad idea, I would say. You may not like police and crime commissioners. They may not be working desperately well across the country, but the idea that these that have been in post for 3 or 4 years should now be removed without a grand plan for what should replace them, you should resist. Difficult to do, given you've campaigned on it, but you should think about this. And the major reason you should think about this is it's not the big issue. The big issue confronting all political parties for policing is the organisation of policing. So I said 41 constabularies outside of London, so 43 police forces in England and Wales, if you count the 2 in London. It's madness. They knew it was madness in the 1960s, but they couldn't bring themselves politically to do anything about it. They reduced the 125 odd that they had there down to the 43 eventually that we have now, but it no longer works. Pretty much everybody knows that it doesn't work. The difficulty we have for our incoming ministers is our Conservative Home Secretary introduced police and crime commissioners. She or he is stuck with them now. So you can't reorganise the police very easily because you're stuck with these 43 folk. The Labour Party wish to get rid of them, but what they should really be doing first is thinking about amalgamation or nationalisation. Should we have 1 police force or 5 or 15? But we've never resolved this issue, and most Home Secretaries have thought about it and they've shied away from it. But that should be the top of our set of list of questions for our incoming ministers. The second thing in relation to policing is funding. Something like a 7 to 10% drop in funding over the last 4 years, a lot more on the way in planning, a 14 or 15% drop in the workforce in the last 4 years, a lot more on its way. What's going to be left of policing, and what can policing do? So the big issues, I think, for the political parties then become, how do we cope with this? How do we sell it? How do we manage it? And does policing become some kind of rump fire brigade activity, or can we sustain the kind of broad, neighbourhood-focused, social service-oriented policing that traditionally, may not feel like that always, but traditionally British policing has been? So big options for our incoming Home Secretary. There's then the question of relationships for our Minister. Do you want to re-establish good relationships with the police? Our reformist Home Secretary, up until 2015, has fought the police, and indeed almost a badge of honour to take on the police service in all sorts of, I think, personally very brave ways, as well as also possibly some slightly less well-advised ways. Sorry, I was trying to choose some words. Slightly less well-advised ways there. The Labour Party, I think, will wish to re-establish very good relationships. And just like the health service and other things, the phrase that he or she will regularly hear is, morale is at an all-time low. Just like Julian, I mean, we won't necessarily agree about everything, but we will agree on the morale question. They should ignore this one and remember the words of the current and the final president of the Association of Chief Police Officers, who's now in his late 50s, early 60s, who said, don't worry about these things. Morale's been at an all-time low ever since I joined the police. So that's policing. We've got a series of choices for our political parties. Secondly, prisons. What are we going to do? Prisons are a mess. Minister, you have to do something about it, would be what the Permanent Secretary does. We're writing our document. Our issues are, do we want to think about constructive ways in which we can reduce the highest prison population we've ever had in England and Wales? 40-odd thousand in the 1980s, 85,000 today, only 81,000 when the coalition government took office. It's not a party political thing. Prison growth has been carrying on unrestricted for well over 2 decades. It costs more and more money. It gets no more efficient. Arguably, in all sorts of ways, it gets less and less efficient. Let's think about constructive ways to do something about this. Now, the problem we have as civil servants in playing this out is that our 2 main political parties are probably not too keen to hear this lesson. So we can think about restorative justice, we can think about new forms of community provision, we can think about alternatives to custody, and we can lay them out as constructively as we like. But at the moment, it's probably only the Liberal Democrats who will want to hear that message. Not that they have thought that through particularly well, but they're the only ones who are talking about it publicly. We will want to think about regimes, Minister, we will want to say, because they are a mess. The greater the prison population, the worse the conditions inside, would be, roughly speaking, I think, what's happening. You simply cannot do the constructive things you want to do with prisoners in overcrowded prisons. And overcrowded prisons are what we have and what we've had for a very long time. We have a rising suicide rate in prison. We have a massive number of people, a very significant proportion of the prison population with mental health problems. You need to be thinking about social care options and a variety of forms of community care as alternatives for these. But again, not necessarily, obviously, things you're going to be able to sell terribly easily. And then finally, 2 things, and I'll finish. Probation. The big ideological divide. What we've seen in the last 3 years, so it's an easy sell, an easy write in terms of putting together policies for an incoming government for a Conservative-oriented administration, because it will be more of the general programme that's been set in train over the last 3 or 4 years, which is essentially a contracting out. The progressive ending of social work-oriented, public service-oriented probation as we've known it for a century, and the gradual shift of that into the voluntary and private sectors. So a complete reconstruction of probation and reconstruction of the way in which we deliver services to those serving community sentences or on release from custody. That's what will happen, and that's a straightforward document to write for our incoming Conservative government. For any other administration, we have a problem. We can write the alternative, and they will want to think about it, but how on earth they do it, either financially or just structurally, the genie's out of the bottle. Reconstructing a probation service is impossible, I suspect. But maybe it offers your civil servant the most imaginative possibilities. And then finally, what else is there? Well, what really will be talked about by Home Affairs politicians in the elections, immigration. Immigration has been the big dog whistle one. That's what they'll all talk about. The borders, how we secure them, how we protect ourselves against terror, the Snoopers Charter, intercepting communications, and so forth. So all those will go down on pretty much any incoming government document. The two out there which we will put front and centre for only particular incoming governments are a government that has any kind of Conservative or UKIP membership. Well, we'll want to think about withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights, because both have committed themselves to doing it. And only if we have a significant Liberal Democrat involvement in the new coalition, we can think imaginatively about drugs. No one else wants to do so, but they've committed themselves to thinking about some quite radical alternatives, both to the management of drug use and to criminal justice or non-criminal justice responses to possession. And with that, I'll finish.
Great, thank you. So you remind me there, Tim, that we had an event, as I said, on defence and foreign affairs a couple of weeks ago, and our colleagues who were speaking at that event made the point that in terms of coalition or minority government building, that the easiest fit in terms of many foreign affairs policies and defence policies was the Conservatives and Labour. But there, still. Could I just add from the chair one final thought, which John touched, in fact, all three of our speakers have touched on, and that is the way in which the devolution of power and the future of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland affects social policy, indeed a wide range of policy in the UK. Although Scotland, and to some extent from time to time Northern Ireland, has always had separate systems, in the Scots case with separate laws, albeit previously made in Westminster, we're now moving to a point where Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all operate national health themselves in a separate form, and schools, education systems that are different to those in England, and they're run separately. But, as John implied, as far as Scotland and Wales are going, they're going off in a different direction in terms of taxation, and from Scotland's point of view in terms of welfare. This is all very radical stuff. Today, newspapers or the press and the radio and TV and the press have been dominated by the idea that Greater Manchester might take over £6 billion worth of the NHS. Now, I don't know how far that's going to happen. We'll find out in the days and weeks ahead. All I'd say is that the sort of English solution or English aspects of devolution could begin to change the provision of public services into a rather more fragmented way in England, as well as in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. As John says, it is quite possible that we will end up with a government which might be, let's say, a Labour Liberal Democrat or Labour SNP government, which couldn't get English legislation through, or couldn't get it through because there'd be a Conservative majority in England, and that would be constitutional, or potentially very constitutionally unusual. So we are in interesting times, constitutionally as well as in terms of public service. Enough. Now, questions to our panel. We'll take them perhaps one or two at a time. Feel free to get going and hold back. Would you like to start us off? Yeah, one at the front here. Now, the thing you're going to be handed is not a microphone. Just to show, it's not a microphone, but it will pick up what you say. So can you speak nice and loud, because it'll record it for the camera, but people over there may not quite hear you. So do speak Thank you.
Hello, my name is Paul Nysarek. In terms of public service funding, which, the retrenchment, I think, that as it's been described, I think a lot of the advanced countries that have got down to the kind of levels that are being talked about have often, as far as I understand it, the big areas that they differ in spending is that they tend to have more private input into the health service and to pensions. Those are often the two big areas that advanced economies that spend less than we do. Now, given that those seem to be, notwithstanding some of the comments, those seem to be pretty sacrosanct areas for change in the UK. So the areas that seem most likely to be put under strain are areas that aren't under strain in some of those other economies. So I suppose my question is, if the panel were betting people, is retrenchment going to fail, i.e. we won't make the kind of retrenchment in public spending happen that is being described? Or will it happen and with some substantial consequences for public services? Interested in people's take as to which of those is more likely to happen.
Okay, let's start. Right, one back there.
Hi, I'm Vincent. My question is about the National Health Service. Do you think that a National Health Service which is fundamentally free at the point of use is sustainable over the long term? If so, why? And if not, what reforms are needed? Thank you.
Okay, that's a good matching pair because they really do address the stresses and strains on the idea of services free at the point of delivery, and also whether or not privatisation, which is often seen as an anathema in parts of British public services, though not in other countries, might have to be extended. John,
shall I just talk about the first one?
Yeah.
I would say, because I'm an optimist, that I think it will fail. And I think for the following reason. Over the last 5 years, public spending in real terms has only fallen by 2.6%. So we have been dominated by 5 years of debate about cuts and austerity, but the aggregate figure is only a 2.6% fall. Why has that happened? And it's happened because the big ticket items, which are pensions, the NHS and schools, and by the time you've talked about those, you are talking about a lot more than half of public spending, have been protected. And they continue to be protected. I mean, David Cameron's watered down the pledge on schools a bit. Labour have made a pledge on schools that will still be some cuts per pupil. I think I can't remember exactly how it works.
Pupil numbers are going up a lot.
Because pupil numbers are going up, so it's per pupil. There are some things that people might do to pensions, given that we now have this system called the triple lock, where pensions go up by the better of prices, earnings, or slightly oddly 2.5%. You could trim that a bit, but you do have to remember that the UK pension system, in terms of what the state does, is one of the least generous in the industrialised world. And it's kind of not obvious that there's a huge public appetite for that, the flat rate bit of the pension to go. And clearly the Conservative government thinks there's mileage, as far as the electorate are concerned, in pledging to continue to protect winter fuel payments, free bus passes and free TV licences for the oldest pensioners, which are kind of other people might be gunning for. But by the time you've protected all of that, there's not a lot left over, and there's increasingly little left over. The welfare state is now 2/3 of the total, as I was saying earlier. The bit that's called welfare, in the pejorative sense, is actually a very small part of the total, despite what your HMRC taxpayer statement may have implied by large orange bit labelled welfare, which actually includes judges' pensions and personal care for the elderly and pensioner benefits like the winter fuel payment. But what we've already seen is within that, because of that protection, the 2.6% overall fall in public spending translated into a 30% cut in some items, including central government grants to local authorities, including very sizable cuts in social care, and I'll agree completely with what Julian was saying about we have rising demand for social care, we have falling provision. That's outside the protected area, but for how much longer? And there are fewer and fewer items left that people don't really know in the end, don't value, and that leaves a very uncomfortable choice facing an incoming government, that whatever they say in the election campaign, it may be actually be less uncomfortable to increase taxes than to push through with quite the degree of cuts that people have said, given how much little there is left outside the protected items.
Julian, privatisation, co-payments perhaps?
Co-payments, yeah. I've worked on the National Health Service and various aspects of the National Health Service for more decades than I care to remember. And what happens is about every 2 or 3 years, a seminar is held by a right-wing think tank of one kind or another, often funded by one of the big, either by a pharmaceutical company or by one of the big 4 accountancy firms. And it will always have the same graph, and the graph will show the rise in spending on the health service just projected forward for a few years, and then it'll have rising demand. It'll have a graph showing demand, and the demand will be going like that, and they will always point to this gigantic gap between demand and supply that's going to occur in about 18 months' time, usually is the usual prediction. It never happened. Endlessly the argument is put forward the NHS is simply not sustainable, and yet somehow it staggers on. And not only in the UK, but in other countries such as Germany or France, with what many people think are very reliable health services, largely free at the point of use. They stagger on. We don't see an enormous demand for increasing co-payments, for privatisation of the finances, the health service in these countries. And I can see no particular reason to suppose that things are going to change very dramatically in the near future. So the answer is yes, I do think it's sustainable, and I don't see that there will be some kind of massive privatisation of finance over the next government.
And the issue of more private or voluntary provision, which other states which are, equally or more social democratic than Britain is arguably, quite comfortable with this. But we've seen recently a debate about this in Britain, where there is, as far as I can see, quite a wide sense that people don't want private or even voluntary provision very far into the NHS. I mean, because voluntary is private at some level in these terms.
Yes, this is an interesting debate, and one where there seems to be a curious degree amount of illogicality that goes on. As I pointed out earlier, GPs are actually private; they're private providers. So a very large chunk of the NHS is already privately provided. I've been looking into a bit as what the arguments are for the people who say nobody should make a profit out of healthcare, or there should be no for-profit. I mean, in a sense, they can't mean it literally, because, a lot of us make a profit or living out of healthcare. I make a living out of it to some extent, doctors, nurses, whatever. Or they're referring to the institutions, such as hospitals. Presumably they don't mean that by saying there should be no profit, they don't mean that the hospital should go bust year upon year. There must be some notion that revenues must cover costs, or indeed greater than costs, and creating a surplus. I think what they're really objecting to, or where the objection really comes from, is not so much the making of profit, but the distribution of profit. It's the worry, really, about evil, probably American corporations sweeping in, gobbling up our health service, and ruthlessly exploiting the imperfections in the market in order to make large profits that are then distributed to their shareholders. And actually, I have a measure of sympathy for that argument. I think there is a problem in any public sector institution, when the major decision maker in that institution has no stake in the situation other than simply to make money. Now, large corporations or corporations are controlled by shareholders, at least in those shareholders. Of course, there are such things as ethical shareholders, but the prime motivation of the shareholders is basically to make money. And the SAG is, as we all know, healthcare markets are very imperfect in various ways, including publicly funded healthcare markets. And there is room for exploitation in those consequences. So actually some sort of, as I mentioned very briefly in my position, something more, a form of ownership such as in the voluntary sector or a mutual sector, where you have ownership by actual employees themselves. I think that form of, quote, privatisation might be much more acceptable and may do a better job.
Okay, very good. Tim, now, police have faced. They are not part of the protected services, and more than that, they've begun to try to charge here and there for services, and a lot of them are contracting out their back offices. So the world is different in policing, isn't it?
The world's different in policing. We would have thought the world was different in probation, but not now.
Well, that's true. That's
so we had a publicly funded probation service 5 years ago. We don't now. It's gone. It disappeared a couple of months ago, never to return, as I was implying. There's a very strong feeling that these things could never happen to the police, and I'm sure that's true to a degree. But the contraction in public policing is not nearly as great as it's intended to be, and it may well become in the next few years. And if it contracts, then all bets are off, I think. So the idea that we face a future of a much more obviously mixed market of policing, I think, is almost an inevitability. How long it will take, I don't know, but I think that's the future.
interesting. Very good. Okay, a couple more questions. One.
Hi. You've talked quite a lot this evening about social policy, but we haven't talked too much about inequality. And I'm quite interested to hear what you think the government could do post-election to address the perceived levels of inequality at the moment, and whether or not you think any of the current parties will actually be brave enough or honourable enough to do something about it.
Okay, just for those at the back and for the camera, what about inequality? What could a government do, and what could a brave government do, if I can summarise that? And guy by the wall over there.
Hi. So you all, it's quite related to this question. You mentioned that in order not to cut, there might be some reforms then to taxation. Is there any scope for an increase in revenues from somewhere, and from where, if possible?
Okay, they are related questions. And if I can just batten onto that second question, no Chancellor of the Exchequer has got taxation as a share of GDP in Britain up above 38% since 1990. So it's becalmed at that point. So I'd just like to, in answering that, to bear that thought in mind. John, I'm kind of keep doing it in this order, keeps it sort of right way to do it.
Yes, I'm sorry we weren't talking exactly to the title. Let's distinguish a little bit between income inequality and wealth inequality. The first thing on income, well, on both of them, can I just say that some of you will have heard of the book that Thomas Piketty published last year called Capital in the 21st Century, which has had a lot of coverage. Some of you may have gone to his lectures. There's going to be a new book that will be launched at LSE on the 30th of April at 6:30 by Professor Tony Atkinson of Oxford University, which I think is currently called Inequality, What Can We Do?, which will lay out his personal views of what one could do that would make a significant difference to the level of inequality in industrialised countries like the UK, with some worked examples for what could be done in the UK. I think so I very much encourage you to get that book when it's published. and to come along to his lecture on the 30th of April, I think he will see that in order to make a significant difference to inequality, you have to do really quite radical things that we will hear very little of in the current election, possibly from the Green Party, I think. Just on two aspects of that. One is clearly you can stop making it worse. One of the fundamental decisions made by the coalition government was that in deficit reduction, 3/4 of that should come from spending cuts and 1/4 should come from tax increases. It's incredibly difficult to make. It's not impossible, and in some ways the coalition has protected some public services that are most important people at the bottom. It's very hard to cut public services without that affecting people on lower incomes more than people on higher incomes. And certainly we've seen, as far as cash benefits are concerned, and what's happened to direct taxes, where direct taxes have been cut through the higher income tax allowance, that the effect of that has been inequality increasing. So you can stop doing that kind of thing, but that means doing things like keeping up the level of benefits for people of working age in line with other people's incomes, rather than freezing them, for instance. But I mean, that's straight back to what we do about public spending. If you're going to increase taxes, that's going to be obviously incredibly difficult, given that most people have not had a rise in their living standards since about 2003. So certainly we have an electorate that has had, many of them, a fall in living standards recently, very little recovery. And you're now turning around and saying that we should put taxes up. That then pushes people towards towards saying, let's take it off the rich. And by the rich, they mean somebody who is richer than them, even if they are, like most members of LSE academic staff, within the top 10% of the income distribution, or indeed MPs on 67,000 a year who are at the 95th percentile, I think, of the earnings distribution, getting on for that. Certainly approaching certainly well within the top 10%. They certainly mean somebody else. And it becomes rather easy to say, let's do it to somebody else. And I think on the wealth side, there are two good examples of that. We have very low taxation on wealth. And one of the few examples that we have of that is council tax, which is a very unprogressive tax on wealth, because the progression between the bands is very shallow, so that you don't pay a lot more if you've got a house worth 750,000 than if you've got a house worth 200,000. But the main opposition party at the moment confines itself to talking about a mansion tax on houses worth above £2 million. Now, that doesn't affect most people. There was quite an interesting article in The Guardian by Simon Jenkins, who seemed to have spent a lot of time talking to Tony about how much money you could really raise if you're only interested in taxing people with property worth over £2 million, whereas you could raise significant money and have a more progressive effect if you tweaked the council tax system. But tweaking means ordinary people who think of themselves as ordinary, but are actually in the top quarter, paying much higher council tax. Not, as the article pointed out, higher in relation to what people used to pay in rates before the poll tax came in the mid-1980s. But the fuss around that politically, and then the Labour candidates for mayor pulling away and saying, what is Labour doing, talking about a mansion tax, because that will affect little old ladies rattling around in £2 million properties, and we can't have that. It's just a lesson of how incredibly hard it is to do that. And I think the Green Party's manifesto yesterday, I didn't follow all the details of it, all the debate around it, but as I understand it, the Green Party is suggesting that there should be a wealth tax that would take 1% of the wealth of the top 1%. I think they're rather over-optimistic about how much wealth the top 1% have, but even if the top 1% have only got £1 trillion, that's 300,000 households with £1 trillion. If you only start taxing them above £3 million, which is what the Green Party was suggesting, you have to ramp up the tax incredibly rapidly from the 3 million on first pound. You know, so even the Green Party, which is very radical, seems to be saying its wealth tax plans, but I may have got them wrong, maybe somebody in the Green Party here who knows better, that those of us with wealth below £3 million, but actually quite a lot of wealth, are going to be exempt from it. And it's so, I think there's a huge barrier in terms of progressive moves, in terms of the way in which people who are actually wealthy by comparison with most of the population don't think they're wealthy, and put in front of them a group of little old ladies as a sort of human shield to say, don't touch my house or my wealth, because there might be somebody with very low income who would be hit by it as well. And that's why the Labour candidates for mayor are reacting the way they are. So there are things you could do. Come along and listen to Tony Atkinson's lecture on the 30th of April. But politically, they are just unbelievably hard.
Okay, I'm going to... Do you want to say something, Julie? No, we'll just take a couple. First time I've heard the word only put in front of a trillion before. Only a trillion. Interesting.
We're not going to respond to the inequality.
Do you want to? Yeah, do if you want to.
Yeah,
Yes,
can we?
Absolutely. Yes.
I'll keep it very brief,
No,
but I was just I thought I had to, so I was scribbling a couple of notes.
Please do.
On the basis that so what can a brave government do in relation to inequality? I'm just going to treat it on my territory, so not my esteemed colleagues' territory, because I know very little about it. But criminal justice, what can they do? Three things. First of all, inequality of treatment. Treat misconduct by the wealthy, by corporations, by those who avoid tax, by those who are involved in, vanilla tax avoidance. Was it avoidance? So, treat as seriously corporate malfeasance and misconduct as you might the misconduct of crimes of the streets. 1. 2, deal first and foremost with inequality in workforces. So deal seriously with the scandalous underrepresentation of women and people of colour in the judiciary, in the police service, in all the other professions in the criminal justice system, and of course probably in political parties too. And 3, targets. Don't forget, what was our hashtag? Terror actually works. Okay? Hashtag. Do not forget it. Impose targets which take seriously the idea that people must be treated equally, and that the unequal treatment of ethnic people of different ethnic origins or by gender is something which you will not allow, and measure it, and then make the ministers sob at the meeting. Thank you.
Julie,
Well, it was just a quick thing. I think there's scope for change in taxation to deal with inequality in terms of inheritance tax. Now, inheritance tax is deeply politically unpopular. Well, it's deeply unpopular in the country. I've never quite understood why. It always seems to be the ultimate fair tax in some ways. But I think the way to deal with it is perhaps to think about what they call in the jargon hypothecation of the revenues. I mean, if the revenues were from inheritance tax were used to fund a particular, I don't know how to phrase it, a baby of mine that the coalition government killed, called the Child Trust Fund, of which some of you may have heard, which was basically a savings. The government opened a savings account for every baby born in the United Kingdom, and put a small amount of money in, and then that was other people could save into that account. Parents and so on could save into that account, and grandparents, but nobody could touch the savings until the child was 18. And by the magic of compound interest and so on, that could lead to rather dramatic increases in ownership of wealth and spread across the country. And that would seem to me that, and if one hypothecated the revenues from inheritance tax to fund something like that, you could take the wealth of one generation and use it to fertilise the growth of the next. But that would seem to me to be a rather quite a catchy slogan and quite a good way forward.
Okay, we are just at time, but if there's a couple of further questions we can deal with swiftly, I don't want to put pressure, but somebody must have a question they felt hasn't been touched on so far. Yep. Very good.
Hello. it's basically around the NHS and inequality, but if the supply-demand debate around the NHS is more kind of hyperbole than a substantiated fact, who is this kind of scaremongering? Who is it serving? That's the first question. And secondly, who are the biggest winners in terms of growing inequality?
Okay. Who's the biggest winner?
Okay, I'll take that.
Well, you know the answer to that. You probably
exactly.
point to an individual.
Advert. Please come along. I think the Hong Kong Theatre downstairs at 6:30 on March the 12th. We're publishing a report on who have been the winners and losers since 2007. And just as a sort of advert ahead of that, I can tell you who the biggest losers are. The biggest losers are people who were born in the 1980s, just across the board, and therefore the winners to a large extent have been people who are in their late 50s and early 60s, such as one sees some members of on the panel. But we also,
how dare you?
We've got some more. We've got some more numbers. We've got a lot of breakdowns by gender and ethnicity and things like that. And I think just the easiest thing to say is that being born while Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister turns out to have been not very good for your economic prospects since the crisis started.
The scaremongers on the NHS, it's the providers of medical services, from pharmaceutical companies to the British Medical Association, and they're also the principal winners.
Right, okay. All right, now, before we all go, I'd like to thank our panel who have kept to the terms of the debate, thinking about what's going to happen or what politicians facing the general election of any party should be aware of, the issues that they should bear in mind, particularly not only in terms of drafting manifestos, but in those early days after the general election, if they're trying to come up with policies, haven't got any before, they'll have plenty of policies, it's which ones to proceed with, I guess, that's important. And also, of course, for civil servants who are, as I think Tim said, or Julian said, get a chance and do actually, once we go into the immediately pre-general election period, have a chance to draft their own view of what they think the manifestos for each party would mean for them as civil servants if they had to enact them. So that's one thing. We have it's just a cornucopia of future events here, isn't it? Michael Barber, who was mentioned earlier, is speaking on Monday the 16th of March about his experiences in the sort of targetary world and beyond in improving public provision. So that's one event. And then there are 3 more general election-themed events. One on Wednesday the 4th of March on housing policy. One, which will touch on some of these issues again, I suspect. One on Europe, was popular on that, on the 11th of March. And on the economy on the 18th of March. So I think that's every Wednesday, actually, from now to the end of term. Hope you'll all come to many of those. And I'd just like to thank our 3 speakers once again for this evening's excellent. Thank you.